as an adult, Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them. For the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." You see, when the disciples were trying to understand what the kingdom of God was, and where it was, and how they could get to it, Jesus does not launch into a 3-point sermon or a PowerPoint presentation. He bends down and opens his arms and embraces the little children that are running toward him. Children are indeed fresh expressions of God's love. They are incarnational theology all wrapped up in little bodies with big hearts. They understand God and our world in a profound way that has nothing to do with power or knowledge and everything to do with wonder and humility. You know, we lose this wonder as we get older. We think that there has to be an answer for every question and a proof for every belief. As author John Plump says, "You know children are growing up when they start asking questions that have answers." We don't know what kind of questions the boy Jesus was asking the rabbis when he wandered away from his parents at Passover and decided to stay in Jerusalem a while longer. But what we do know is that after 3 frantic days of his parents looking for him, they found 12-year-old Jesus in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And whatever his questions were, they amazed everyone. And in his asking questions, they found that he had understanding and answers. Notice that the wisdom here is not in Jesus giving us answers, but in his asking of the questions. It is significant that the one story we have of Jesus as a boy is one where he is in the temple asking questions. It signals a few things. One, while God can be experienced everywhere, even Jesus knew there was something different about going to church, if you will, and asking questions of his spiritual elders, aka rabbis, that were there. 2, the questions of children clearly have something to do with God speaking to us in our world today. And 3, the interaction between children and elders creates holy ground for new understanding. See, the rabbis in the temple don't shun Jesus out of their sight. Now, I don't know how much time you've spent with a 12-year-old boy recently. I know there was just a youth lock-in a couple nights ago, but they let Jesus hang around with them for 3 days without complaint. They don't see him as a nuisance, but rather as a source of wisdom and understanding, as an equal when it comes to insight about the faith. When it comes to faith, there is no age when you become a sage. Faith is mysterious like that. We don't learn a lot of facts and then master faith. Rather, we learn to ask a lot of questions until we let faith master us. And children are our best teachers in letting go of ego and control. In particular, there's a naivete and innocence to children, to the statements they make and the questions they ask. They can so easily believe in things that don't make sense to our adult minds. They don't censor themselves. They're very direct, and in that way, their wisdom is so pure and often full of truth. Listen to these anecdotes from parents and teachers about children. My son went over to the house of our neighbor who had just lost his wife, and he sat on his lap. When he came home, I asked him what he said to the old man, and he replied, nothing. I just helped him cry. I was looking through my son's primary school workbooks and saw that at age 5, he answered the prompt, "Something special about me is, ... with, "I am no one else." When my uncle was very sick in the hospital, my son looked at me and said, "Does everyone die?" "Eventually, yes," I responded. My son looked down and said nonchalantly, "Well, if we're all going to die, then why are we so afraid of it?" Last summer, I asked my US-born niece whether she considered herself Indian or American. "Earthling," she replied, and scampered away. My daughter at 7 was looking introspectively in the mirror, and I asked her what she was thinking about, and she said, "My brain is so weird. All it wants to do is think about me, all the time, like I'm the center of the universe. Mommy and Daddy, does that ever happen to you?" My 6-year-old asked me, "Why aren't you laughing, Daddy?" "I have a lot on my mind," he said. "Well, if you lose some of your mind, maybe then you can laugh." A couple of nights ago, our 4-year-old kept following me around the house, refusing to allow me any personal space. And when I couldn't take it anymore, I said, "Can you give me 5 minutes of peace, please?" "Sure. Where would you like it? In the Middle East?" My 2-year-old daughter, after watching the treetops for 10 minutes, says, "Trees can't speak, but they tell you things." My grandson asked me why we call people African American, Hispanic, Asian. He said, "If their name is Mike, why don't we just call them Mike?" When I asked my 5-year-old son how his day was, he said it was awesome. I said, "What made it so awesome?" "Because I wanted it to be." My daughter came home from school one day and asked me, "How are we supposed to meet new people if we're not allowed to talk to strangers?" If you want to read more of these, Little Hoots is a great blog on Huffington Post. It's also an app and a Facebook page, and you parents and grandparents can post your own little ones' wise and witty sayings there. So yes, I definitely believe that God speaks to us through children. Do you see how much candid truth there was in those anecdotes? When a child asks a question, especially a question that we don't have an answer to, we are made aware, once again, of how mysterious the world really is. It's almost as if God calls us back to our childlike state through the presence of children in our lives. And without them, we would never leave our adult minds. We never would get a reprieve from all of the logic and facts and proof and answers that we trap ourselves in as we age. But we do age, don't we? It's part of life. Isn't it amazing how developmentally, as we get into our senior years, we become more and more like children again? We go from being completely dependent on others as children to becoming independent as adults to going back to being dependent on others as seniors. We go from physical weakness as children to physical strength as adults, back to physical frailness as seniors. And for those who have debilitating diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's, even our minds revert back to a childlike state, unable to remember, unable to communicate, even unable to understand the most basic of concepts, only able really to live in the present moment, even if that moment repeats itself over and over and over again. And yet, if this developmental cycle is true, that means that the same wisdom that we possess from children who are naive, we also gain as spades as we become senior adults. And we live with what philosopher Paul Ricoeur called our second naivete. In other words, we've lived through the critical phase in our life of deconstructing and reconstructing ideas and faith, and we've returned to that craving for myth and symbolism and meaning. all of which ask us to read stories and understand the world in more simple ways, even though they're not simplistic at all. It's just that we have come to know all that we can about the world. You know, that our faith is complex and it's difficult, and we've chosen to let go of what we don't know because it's been gripping us so tightly, and it's actually been robbing us of life. And so we return to this state that he calls second naivete. And it's not like the naiveness of children, which is innocent, right, just because of one's lack of knowledge. In a state of second naivete, we have all of the knowledge of adults, but we choose to hold that alongside all the seeking and wonder of children. We need to let go of the need to know and to be right, and instead find our way into wanting to be known and just to be. As Ricoeur says, beyond the desert of criticism, we wish to be called again. In answering that calling, we enter this second half of life, as Father Richard Rohr calls it. Or, as C.S. Lewis says, someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. Now, you could say that the second naivete is what we see in the elder priest, Eli, in our story from 1 Samuel. Eli is a priest in the temple, which makes him a spiritual elder, but we also know he's just plain old because his eyesight is going, and also the text tells us so. He's had quite a life, and his sons have been causing him grief and God grief. 1 Samuel 2 says, "The sons of Eli were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord or for the duties of the priests to the people. And Eli was very old, and it grieved him when he heard all that his sons were doing to Israel and how they lay with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting." And it goes on and on. You may read it yourself. You see, Eli's sons were not following in his footsteps. However, a young boy, Samuel, had come to live at the temple to be mentored by Eli into the priesthood. Samuel was given to Eli by his mother Hannah because she prayed to God for a child when she thought she could no longer have one, and she had Samuel, so she dedicated his life to God's service. And Samuel seemed to take to his priestly life quite naturally. 1 Samuel 3 is a classic text of God speaking to someone, and that someone not recognizing the voice speaking to them as God's voice. Essentially, this is what our whole summer sermon series is about, right? Say what? But in this case, Samuel hears what the voice is saying. He recognizes his name, but he does not recognize the source. He thinks it's Eli, which he naturally would. Now, if the voice of God sounded like Lucy Cryle, as very well it might, I don't think Samuel would have mistook an old man for God, but that's a topic for another day. What I love about this text is that Eli himself does not automatically know that it's God calling Samuel either. Granted, it's the middle of the night, and Eli is doing what any parent or guardian does in the middle of the night when their child comes to them and asks for a glass of milk or for this, that, or the other. Go back to bed. It wasn't until the third time that this happens that the fog begins to lift from Eli's eyes and ears, and it dawns on him that it's the Lord calling Samuel. I see this text kind of as a microcosm of this example of moving from naivete to using our logic and reason to this second naivete. And I'll explain what I mean. Instead of it happening over a lifetime, we kind of see it happen in one night here. You see, the young boy, Samuel, is naive, of course. He's a young boy. He just assumes that the voice he hears calling him is Eli, and he runs into Eli's room to wake him up. And Eli, being the logical adult that he is, hears Samuel telling him that he's heard a voice calling him. And all Eli can think about in that moment is literal voices as well. And he says, I didn't call you. Go back to bed. You must be hearing things. He's using his reason and rationale to deal with the question at hand. But then, after 3 times, it's almost as if he has an epiphany. Of course, it's the Lord calling the boy. But it took 3 times for Eli to come to this understanding. Sometimes it takes us a while to let go of the things we understand about this world and how the world works in order to let in some room for God's mystery and presence. It's not that Eli did not think it was possible for God to talk to humans. I mean, it had happened to him. It's just that even with that personal experience, his first default when Samuel said he heard a voice in the night was that it was a human voice. And it took him a while to realize, oh, maybe it's God. And that's from a priest, right? Someone who's supposed to be extra tuned in to God. So what about the rest of us? Well, we don't think of the supernatural first, I don't think. We think of the natural order of things first. And it's only when we allow ourselves to realize that conventional logical answers aren't working in a given situation that we start to wonder, maybe there's another way of thinking about this. Maybe this is God speaking to me through a child, a dream, an adult, a tree. See, Eli reaches this point of second naivete, of letting go of reason and rationale. And he lets some mystery in, and it's in that moment that he knows it is God calling Samuel. And he gives Samuel the response that he needs to speak to God. And then the Lord begins to speak. And naive Samuel gets a message that is way beyond his years in terms of intensity and severity. This is grown-up stuff that God is telling Samuel. Essentially, God tells Samuel that he needs to tell Eli that his family is going to be punished for all the evil they have done. It's a hard message for a young boy to give his mentor. Terrifying, really. So I love how in the text it says, Samuel lay there until morning. I can just imagine him awake, wide-eyed, the thoughts running through his mind. How the heck am I supposed to break this news to Eli? How do I tell them this? And what does this even mean? I don't even understand what God said to me. And if something's going to happen to Eli, then, gosh, does that mean he's not the priest anymore? And I have to be the priest? I'm just a boy. You know how our minds run off in the night. Eventually morning comes, and indeed we learned that Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. Of course he was afraid. But being the wise elder that he was, Eli knew that Samuel would be afraid. And Eli himself had no fear. He had lived long enough to trust God and to know that worrying about what was to come wouldn't solve anything. He's actually very accepting and peaceful about this whole ordeal. He accepts it kind of with a peace and a non-attachment that you think of like a Zen master, right, or a guru of some kind. But the reality is Eli is like many elders in our midst. He's come to an acceptance in life that only comes with experience and having lived life long enough to know what matters and what is worth worrying over and what you have no control over and just have to let be. There's a gerontologist at Cornell named Carl Pellimer who said, when turning 50, I began to notice some differences in my perspective on life. The things that bothered me a lot all of a sudden didn't irk me that much anymore. You begin to take a longer view of things. You see how individual events fit into a larger context. And so he started this project, which I really recommend to you. It's called the Legacy Project blog. You can Google it. And it's a place where all of you who are 60 or over can share your wisdom and insights about life. And those of us who are younger can ask you all questions about what should I do in this situation. And it's this wonderful exchange of wisdom. There are all these examples on there, but Pellimer says that the elders he interviewed have a unique ability to advise us. And we've lost that in our society. We've gotten used to motivational speakers and pop psychologists instead of individuals who are right next door or who are in our midst. I couldn't help but think of the church when I read that. So many of the posts on that blog are about living life in the moment, not clinging to the past, about finding joy in the day-to-day. And this is exactly what Eli does. He's able to not worry. He's able to live in the moment with Samuel. He's able to hear and to let himself hear what God has to say. He said, "What was it that God told you? Don't hide it from me. Don't sugarcoat it," he says. Of course, Samuel tells him everything. And isn't it amazing that Samuel, a child, becomes known as a trustworthy mouthpiece for the Lord? In this passage, God speaks to a boy. God speaks through an elder to a boy. And God speaks through a boy to an elder. There are many takeaways from this story, but an obvious one is to cherish the relationships in our midst. That God speaks to the youngest and the oldest among us. And I ask us, how many of us are spending time with the littlest ones in our church? We see them here this morning singing beautifully during the Word for God's Children. But if you want to glean more of that wisdom and joy that only a child can bring, we'd love to have you in our nursery or teaching church school. Or how are you spending time with the eldest in our community? Pastor Mary Holst is putting together sponsors for our VIP program. Those are people who are unable to participate at Calvary on a regular basis. We prefer the term VIP, very important person, instead of homebound or shut-in, because those terms just describe a life situation. They do not tell the story of someone's life. So volunteering to visit the eldest in our congregation is a great way to glean some of that wisdom. And I know what some of you are thinking, and I am a senior, or I am a child. Then today I want you to pat yourselves on the back. Thank you for the unique wisdom that you bring to this community. We value you, we want to hear from you, and I want you to know that your voice matters. You reveal to us glimpses of God that we would not have otherwise. As a child, Jesus chose to be among his spiritual elders, the rabbis. As an adult, Jesus chose to welcome children and point to their hearts and attitudes as the spiritual key to the kingdom of God. I think we can all agree that God speaks to us through the life of Jesus. So that alone is reason to know that God honors and values both children and elders. We need one another. Which means, Calvary, that God is most assuredly speaking through us because we are a multi-generational congregation. This week, surround yourself with either little kids or lots of old folks. And if you don't know where to find those populations, see me after the service and I'll give you some ideas. See what they have to say, because what they have to say just may be what God is trying to say to you and to our world. Amen.